All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second of these two webinars where we're going to recap some of the amazing research that was presented at the International Celiac Disease Symposium this year in Sorrento, Italy. Again, my name is Kate Raber. I'm the program coordinator for the celiac disease program here at Children's National Hospital. We will have a Q&A session at the end, so please enter your questions into that Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to those at the end. So I am going to share my screen now to get this up and going. All right, so we went over this very briefly last week, but for those of you who weren't able to join us, ICDS is the International Celiac Disease Symposium, and it's an international conference that's hosted by the International Society for the Study of Celiac Disease, and it's held every other year. This year, we were in beautiful, sunny Sorrento, Italy, and it also happened to be the first conference where all of the food was gluten-free. So Dr. Coburn and I were over the moon, and I ate fried calamari, all kinds of pasta and pizza, and it was wonderful. The conference location does change every year. So the next one is going to be in Sheffield, England, which is in the north of England and home to the University of Sheffield, which is kind of a powerhouse in celiac research. In 2026, we'll be headed down under to Melbourne. And then finally, we voted at this conference where we would hold the 2028 conference, and that'll be in Tampere, Finland, about 2 hours north of Helsinki. That is home to the Tampere Celiac Research Center, which is also a large player in the celiac world. So these conferences are open to the public, should you decide that you want to go. Now, last week, we did cover a lot of ground. We looked at the situation of patients in Ukraine with celiac disease. We went over updates on COVID-19 and celiac, nutrition and eating problems, and rounded out the night talking about mental health. So tonight, we're going to focus on gluten-free diet, knowledge, and adherence, the patient experience, and future treatments. And then here on the right again, that is the four of us minus our dietitian, Lauren Pavone, at our group poster there. So again, we'll start with gluten-free knowledge and adherence. We're not going to go through all of these in extreme detail, but we'll be hitting on the main points of many, if not all. Now, we know that one of the biggest risk factors for developing celiac disease is having a first-degree relative with celiac. In my case, my mom also has celiac disease. Now, there was a study in 2019 from the Mayo Clinic that found that 44.4% of first-degree relatives that were tested for celiac disease screened positive on a TTG test. So I always talk with our newly diagnosed patients about how they plan on keeping the house, whether or not they're going to be totally gluten-free, how many kids, how many parents are going to be gluten-free as well. The majority of parents prefer to keep some gluten in the house for various reasons, cost and other family members not wanting to give food up. But for many reasons, this means that when a family member is diagnosed with celiac disease, the other family's gluten consumption is theoretically automatically reduced because there's just less gluten around to be consumed. And many families find that making family meals gluten-free is just the easiest way to go about it. So one group from the Netherlands studied how much gluten first-degree relatives were actually eating. This is important because in order to diagnose celiac disease, you have to be eating significant and sufficient amounts of gluten. They found that the daily consumption of gluten by first-degree relatives was actually comparable with the general population, save for older sisters of celiac patients, as they are at a risk of lower gluten intake. So this could, by association, lead to a little bit of underdiagnosis of celiac disease in first-degree relatives. And it's not entirely clear why older sisters were eating less gluten. But regardless, there were still families who didn't reach that recommended level of gluten consumption for celiac testing. But here's the tricky thing. There's not one universally agreed upon number for how much gluten should be consumed in order for celiac testing to be accurate. This is tricky for a number of reasons, not just because of how much more difficult it may be to diagnose people, but also because a lot of pharmaceutical trials require gluten consumption in order to test the drug to see if it's effective. So how do we know how much gluten can be consumed? That is one of the million-dollar questions in celiac disease. But for our purposes, if you want accurate celiac testing, we recommend consuming the equivalent of 2 slices of gluten-containing bread per day for a minimum of 6 to 8 weeks. This figure is used by several celiac centers in the US, and we use that for family members who want to get tested as well as patients who are doing a gluten challenge if they're questioning their diagnosis. Now, it's one thing to not have guidelines as to how to manage a very important part of the celiac diagnosis journey, but it's another to actually have guidelines and not adhere to them. A diagnosis guidelines for celiac disease for both children and adults are in place essentially around the world. Biopsies are considered the only valid diagnosis method for adults, but pediatrics do allow for blood work only diagnoses if the numbers are high enough. Despite these easily accessible guidelines, some physicians don't follow them. I know I've seen patients be given a celiac disease diagnosis and referred to our clinic by a provider whose only testing was the genetics test. If we were handing out celiac diagnoses based on genetics alone, over a third of the world would be given a diagnosis of celiac disease. So researchers from Germany decide to survey patients and their providers about how they diagnose celiac disease. They found that over the last 10 years, at least 28% of adults and 15% of pediatric patients in Germany were not diagnosed according to celiac disease guidelines. This is an abridged table from the poster showing their data. So we can see that as time has gone on, adherence to these diagnostic guidelines has gotten better, but we're still at a good number of patients not properly diagnosed. Getting incorrectly diagnosed with a chronic illness can affect several areas of mental health as well as physical health. It may cause undue stress and lowered quality of life if someone is restricting their diet for no apparent reason, as we saw in one of the studies we looked at last week. Now, diagnostic guidelines were actually a huge topic this year for the lectures, mainly looking at a no biopsy approach. I wrote a bit about biopsies and diagnosis in a newsletter back in April, but let's go over it a bit. Now, one of the major governing bodies of pediatric gastroenterology in the United States is the North American Society for Pediatric Gastroenterology, Hepatology, and Nutrition, better known as NASPGHAN. Equivalent societies exist in Europe as ESPGHAN, in Latin America as LASPGHAN, and Asia and Pacific region, or APSPGHAN. Celiac diagnostic guidelines for pediatric patients are generated from both NASPGHAN and ESPGHAN. Now, the biggest difference between these two schools of thought revolve around the use of upper endoscopies to obtain biopsies from the small intestine. Now, the idea of biopsy as the gold standard for celiac disease diagnosis is in line with NASPGHAN guidelines. First, a patient is screened for celiac disease using blood work. If the patient tests positive, the next step is obtaining tissue from the small intestine, putting it under a microscope, and looking at the extent of the damage due to the disease. However, researchers in Europe conducted a lot of research on this topic and say that you can skip a biopsy if the tissue transglutaminase IgA level, the TTG, is at least 10 times the upper limit of the reference range for the testing being used, and if another test called the endomysial antibody, or EMA, is positive. So this is what the diagnosis would look like at various different labs. You can see that these numbers here are 10 times that upper limit of the reference range here. Now, these European guidelines were extremely helpful during the early days of the pandemic when the hospital was only performing emergency procedures. NASPGHAN did hold a meeting and decided that once the pandemic calmed down enough for routine, or until the pandemic calmed down enough for routine procedures to be performed, GI providers should just use the ESPGHAN criteria for diagnosis. And many of our patients diagnosed during 2020 were diagnosed using these ESPGHAN criteria. But now the hospital is running basically at normal capacity. And in fact, the endoscopy suite is jam-packed and we have a fairly long wait time for procedure scheduling. So what do we do in this situation? Do we stick with ESPGHAN or do we go back to NASPGHAN? We've decided in our program to strike a balance between the two. If a child meets these criteria for SBGAN, we present each family with the pros and cons of a procedure, and you can read a little bit about those here. Now, there was a discussion at the conference about updates to these SBGAN guidelines, including dropping the requirement for genetic testing. But there was also a lengthy discussion about applying these guidelines to adults, and some preliminary research was presented. Currently, North America doesn't have enough research to show whether a non-biopsy approach may be used in the future, but hopefully we'll be able to look at it one day. Despite all of these guidelines, celiac disease sadly remains tricky to be diagnosed with many healthcare providers if symptoms are not GI related. Medical providers around the world are seeing more and more non-GI symptoms when diagnosing celiac disease. The classic view of celiac disease is poor growth and poor weight gain. GI symptoms are also commonly associated with celiac disease, especially more so now than even 20 years ago. But there are still a lot of people whose symptoms aren't GI related. The organization Beyond Celiac surveyed celiac patients and what their reported gluten exposure symptoms were. Many reported versions of these symptoms that you see here on the screen. But they also saw high levels of non-GI symptoms mentioned here. While patients overall tended a little more towards GI symptoms, the non-GI symptoms really weren't that far behind. So we're going to pull up our chat right now and see if you all can pick out which of these symptoms was in the top 5 most commonly reported in this study. So you can choose from any of these on here and we'll see if you get them right. So that chat box is there at the bottom of the screen and I'll give you about a minute or so to type out which ones you think were the most common upon a gluten exposure. Anxiety and brain fog, irritability. I feel like I'm probably irritable during glutenings just because I'm mad that I ate them. Lack of interest in food, fatigue, and anxiety. These are great guesses here. So let's look at these top 5 here. Muscle coordination, irritability, brain fog, and fatigue. So the top 5 most reported are anxiety, headaches or migraines, irritability, brain fog, and fatigue. Fatigue is something that we're seeing a lot, not just in adults, but in children as well. It's kind of one of those very vague symptoms that we see. Now, the frequency of experiencing these symptoms likely stems from several things, but it's namely from how well people adhere to the gluten-free diet. As I mentioned last week, people have different definitions of the gluten-free diet. My definition of the gluten-free diet will be different from someone who feels like they have to live in a bubble just to survive. Regardless, staying on a gluten-free diet has many barriers. We spoke about the cost of gluten-free foods last week, and I briefly mentioned that the sheer cost of gluten-free foods can be a barrier to people, namely those with lower incomes. However, another barrier to good adherence to the gluten-free diet may be what's called health literacy. Now, the CDC defines health literacy as the degree to which individuals have the ability to find, understand, and use information and services to inform health-related decisions and actions for themselves and others. Now, we know that understanding the ins and outs of the gluten-free diet is really complex, and some people may need years of experience before they can truly feel confident in their ability to read labels or go out to eat. Being able to follow a gluten-free diet then would likely necessitate a high level of health literacy. Well, researchers from the University of Roehampton put together a study that was the first to actually look at this. Not surprisingly, they found that celiac patients with higher health literacy scores typically had better gluten-free dietary adherence and better knowledge of what foods are gluten-free, even pointing towards less over-restricting. As a side note, I think that's actually a really excellent aspect of measuring gluten-free diet knowledge. Instead of just measuring which ingredients or behaviors don't keep you gluten-free enough, they measured which behaviors and ingredient avoidance went overboard. They also found that those with a lower health literacy not only had lower gluten-free diet knowledge scores, but were more likely to report often or always having to find difficulty finding food out of the house compared to those with higher scores. Interestingly, patients who considered annual follow-up appointments important had significantly lower health literacy, poor gluten-free dietary adherence, and lower gluten-free dietary knowledge scores compared to those who didn't consider these annual follow-ups important. Now, when I was reading this for the first time, I had to sit and mull that result over in my head actually for a couple of days. Because at first glance, it didn't make a lot of sense to me. Wouldn't people with a higher health literacy understand the importance of regular follow-up with at least a gastroenterologist? But then I realized what the flip side of the coin could be. People with high health literacy may go over the top and say that, well, they understand the gluten-free diet, know what's going on in their body, and don't feel like they need to take extra time to see a specialist for something they perceive to just be getting blood work done once a year. People with low health literacy, on the other hand, may still understand the importance of visiting with medical providers, even if the treatment regimen can be hard to understand. It's therefore important in our roles as gluten-free diet educators that we're able to tailor our education to the patient's level, both at a cultural and health literacy level, in order to get the best patient outcomes. But as I mentioned, health literacy is not the only barrier to gluten-free diet adherence. As we all know, the gluten-free diet is expensive. Now, depending on the product, gluten-free substitutions can be 800% more expensive than their gluten-containing counterparts. As more and more people get diagnosed with celiac disease, the more outreach and underserved population increases. It's important to understand the impact and the burden of treatment in celiac disease from a financial point of view. Now, one poster explored what consequences low income may have on celiac patients. Their results, while not surprising, highlighted an area that really needs to be explored more in celiac disease advocacy. They found that patients with lower incomes were noted to be less adherent to the gluten-free diet, had more severe disease activity, took longer to achieve mucosal healing, and had less normalization of their TTG and deamidated gliadin levels. And very quickly, deamidated gliadin is just another blood marker for celiac disease, but it's much less accurate compared to the TTG. So these results are problematic for many reasons. In celiac disease, food is our medicine. Insurance companies don't cover the increased cost of our groceries. The US government also doesn't provide some sort of voucher or financial help for the increased cost as well. You could try to claim deductions on your taxes every year, but it would require that you keep every single grocery receipt and then find a gluten-containing equivalent for each gluten-free item, and then calculate the difference between the two. And in the end, the difference is typically big for your wallet, but not big enough for a meaningful tax return. Now, many countries in Europe operate using a system that uses a mixture of some or all of these tactics. In fact, some European countries actually sell gluten-free food in pharmacies. Now, in the US, even those with SNAP or WIC benefits may struggle to find foods that meet the strict criteria required for coverage. For example, food stamps require that a bread's first ingredient is whole grain. However, 99% of gluten-free breads have water as their first ingredient, immediately disqualifying them, even if the second ingredient is whole grain. So these types of studies just show us how much work there is left to be done on both a research and an advocacy level. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated many of these issues. A study from our partners at Boston Children's Hospital looked at food insecurity for both gluten-containing and gluten-free foods in the COVID-19 pandemic. They found that 25% of respondents reported general food insecurity and 28% of respondents reported gluten-free food insecurity. Some reported even eating gluten because there were no gluten-free options available. It's incredibly important then that medical providers who treat celiac disease learn more about if their patients are able to locate and access their gluten-free food. Doctors ask their patients all the time about if their patient is taking their medicine and if they can afford it. So shouldn't we be asking the same questions about groceries when we treat this disease with food? So a tool exists already, and it's called the Hunger Vital Sign. It's a validated 2-question survey that screens for food insecurity. In order to fit our needs, though, we've modified it a bit and asked our patients those 2 questions in regard to both regular food as well as gluten-free food. These questions will likely look a little familiar to you if you filled out our pre-clinic survey. Now, we do have a few resources to help those who do express difficulty accessing gluten-free food. Generally, though, people with lower health literacy also have lower incomes, which may put them at a higher risk for gluten exposure. But health literacy and income levels are also not the only predictors of gluten-free diet adherence. A study in Croatia looked at gluten-free diet adherence in both children and adults and then compared the two. Now, they found that there weren't any differences based on sex about whether or not the patient had regular GI follow-up, but they did find that children were significantly more adherent to the diet. This is shown even further when we look at actually accidental gluten ingestions. Only 6% of the children surveyed reported a rare accidental gluten ingestion compared to 9% of adults. When it came to purposeful ingestion, though, no kids ate gluten on purpose and 4% of adults did. When I was reading this, I thought to myself that this was a perfect example of do what I say, not as I do. I think of how much more control parents have over their children's diets than children do themselves. So it just reduces that room for error there. But sometimes adults don't make great decisions, or we're just not as careful because it's something that affects us and not somebody else. Now, another barrier in gluten-free diet adherence is labeling. Believe it or not, there is a science behind the labeling regulations in the United States, though I would still argue that label reading for gluten is a mix between a science and an art. One thing that doesn't make it easier for us here in the States is that gluten is not required to be listed on as an allergen on food labels. Wheat and wheat-derived ingredients are required, but not barley or rye-derived products. All of the countries in red on this map here require that gluten-containing grains be labeled as an allergen on food labels. To save you all from counting, that is 85 countries worldwide that require that. Our neighbors, both to the north and the south of us, require it, but we do not. There is a movement to try to get gluten added to that list of allergens. Advocacy groups were successful in adding sesame to the list, which goes into effect in just a couple weeks here in the start of 2023. However, the FDA has put out some draft guidance that indicates their hesitation to add gluten as an allergen because it is not technically an allergen. Celiac disease is what's called an IgA-mediated disease, whereas true food allergies are IgE-mediated diseases. I personally think it's a weak argument, and many people with celiac have made their voices heard when the FDA asked for comments from the public earlier this year. There are definitely advocacy groups like Beyond Celiac and the Celiac Disease Foundation working on legislative advocacy for people with celiac disease, but it doesn't hurt to write to your representatives to explain that adding gluten as an allergen would make the lives and health of millions of people in the United States much better. Now, our neighbors to the north who do have gluten labeled as an allergen still report difficulty in label reading. Despite gluten being labeled as an allergen, the Canadian Celiac Association surveyed over 2,300 people to learn about their experiences in navigating gluten-free foods. The issue in this case was what we call in the States voluntary labeling, and what they call in Canada precautionary statements. Essentially, this is those statements on labels like made in the same facility, made on the shared lines, etc. Respondents rate certain precautionary statements like may contain gluten or made in a shared facility as riskier, and also expressed confusion over what exactly these claims meant. Over half of respondents avoided products with that precautionary statement may contain gluten, despite a gluten-free label on the packaging. 36% of respondents shared a wide variety of comments, especially regarding their frustration with various labeling claims and decision-making challenges. Now, we can't really apply this to the US because we have different laws, but we have developed a stoplight system based on our experiences and based on best practices to help you make decisions on what kind of voluntary labeling means what. So a red light would mean may contain wheat. We tell our patients to put this back on the shelf. This indicates that the company's production practices on this food item aren't secure enough to avoid cross contact. Yellow light would be manufactured on shared equipment with products containing wheat. This is where we would say, call the manufacturer to ask about their process. Some companies will tell you not to eat it, but others will tell you that it's safe for someone with celiac disease, but not for someone with a wheat allergy. And finally is a green light, produced in the same facility as products containing wheat. Many of these facilities can be massive, several city blocks in length. Now, these products are considered safe for people with celiac disease, and this labeling is geared more towards people with food allergies who react to much smaller amounts of allergens. Think along the lines of a peanut allergy, where you can't even be in the same room for some people. However, if you see any of these statements, but also see a gluten-free claim on the label, you can go ahead and disregard the voluntary statement, as the gluten-free statement trumps that voluntary statement. But Canada is not the only place where gluten is labeled, but difficulty in adhering to the diet is present. Researchers in India named several areas of life where Indian celiac patients struggle to adapt. A third of celiac patients in India inadvertently eat gluten while dining out with friends and family. To me, this number feels pretty low, but that also may reflect the fact that a lot of Indian food is actually naturally gluten-free, except for obvious things like breads and pastries. 45.1% of patients did not have a dedicated flour mill at home for gluten-free flour. Now, again, this is a cultural difference where this metric would not necessarily be useful in a survey in the US, but I still think it's a really interesting metric in India and shows how accommodations for the gluten-free diet kind of change around the world. They also reported some infrastructure issues in India. Despite Northern India having one of the highest rates of celiac disease in the world, education about the disease itself is far behind the knowledge in the Western world. A third of patients reported receiving inappropriate or incorrect information from a dietitian about the gluten-free diet. This, of course, is one of the most obvious barriers there can be to following a gluten-free diet. And finally, they found barriers within the community. 48.6% of respondents reported that it was difficult to find gluten-free foods and that there was a very high cost associated with them. In the US, gluten-free food is pretty widely available, though, again, it is expensive. But in India, not all grocery stores may carry gluten-free substitute products. Because the overall awareness of celiac disease is lower than, say, the US, celiac patients also have a difficult time relaying their needs to their relatives and friends. So this too is a barrier that crosses borders. All too often, I hear patients complaining that a family member, often a well-meaning grandmother, will try and feed them gluten and tell them, oh, a little bit won't hurt you. Now, the last study looking at adherence to the gluten-free diet came from a mix of responses from 4 countries, the US, UK, Germany, and Spain. Now, 82.8% of people reported adhering to the gluten-free diet either always or often. Now, sometimes I find this question very tricky because, like I've mentioned before, the definition of a gluten-free diet is going to change from person to person. People may also interpret this as, I always purposefully adhere to the gluten-free diet, but in reality, they may have accidental ingestions. So while they aren't purposefully eating gluten, they are not technically always following the gluten-free diet. Now, 83.8% of people's last ingestion was accidental, but this also means that 14% of people surveyed purposefully ate gluten. People's experience with the difficulty of the gluten-free diet also changed, and interestingly was pretty evenly spread across the spectrum of ease, so to speak. Gluten exposure symptoms and the types of accidental exposures people had were generally consistent across age, sex, and country. The most common exposures were, not surprisingly, eating out of the house and cross-contact, eating while on vacation, etc., everywhere where you don't have control over your food. But interestingly, Spanish participants reported higher adherence levels and less difficulty in gluten-free diet adherence versus participants of other nationalities. It's unclear why this is, but I will say I've been to Spain twice and neither time had any issues. So what explains all these differences and barriers and experiences? Well, experience is relative to cultures, norms, health literacy, labeling laws, and many other things. Something may be easy to you, but not to someone else. Another example of this would be when I was studying abroad in college in France. One of my French friends was complaining that his registration fees, supplies, and books for the semester cost him 150 euros. My jaw hit the ground because that is cheap for a semester of college. But his jaw hit the ground when I told him $150 would buy me the PDF version of my biology textbook for the semester. And I still had to buy all the textbooks for the 5 other classes I was taking. So everything is relative. So speaking of relative risk, this brings us to the last study of this section. When we talk about navigating the real world in relation to gluten exposure, I remind our patients that every decision we make about everything in life, whether we realize it or not, is a risk assessment. Gauging risk of gluten exposure is just another one of those risk assessments that we start making while on the gluten-free diet. I have historically told our patients that one of the riskiest things to keep in the kitchen is wheat flour, or really any gluten-containing flour. There has never been any quantifiable data, though, to support this suggestion, which is why I was absolutely ecstatic to see this study from our research colleagues at Seattle Children's Hospital. They studied airborne gluten contamination of gluten-free food, and the results were much different than I expected. Now, the team placed different amounts of wheat flour into a kitchen stand mixer, 1 tablespoon, a half a cup, and 2 cups. They then placed several slices of gluten-free bread at various distances from the mixture, at 1 foot, 5 feet, and 10 feet. Then they turned the mixer on for 10 minutes. Once they stopped, they immediately measured air quality, that is, how much flour was in the air or aerosolized, right after they stopped, and then over the next 12 hours. 1 slice of bread at each distance was removed at 1 hour, at 3 hours, 6 hours, and then again at 12 hours after this exposure to the aerosolization. Now, all samples placed at 5 and 10 feet from the stand mixer had less than 20 parts per million gluten contamination, with 81.3% of samples having undetectable levels of gluten, which is less than 5 parts per million. At 1 foot of distance, 37.5% of samples exposed to a half a cup of aerosolized flour, and 100% of samples exposed to 2 cups of aerosolized flour contain more than 20 parts per million. With the 1 tablespoon of flour batch, gluten contamination was undetectable, again under 5 parts per million, even at a close distance to the mixer. Air quality also returned to baseline levels, so meaning levels before the start of the experiment, quite rapidly, returning to baseline between 17.5 to 41 minutes. Now, interestingly, the durations of the exposure to this environment were not significant, meaning that levels of gluten were similar for breads taken 1 hour after exposure and 12 hours after exposure. So what can we derive from this? Well, importantly, this is a pilot study, which means that it's a small scale study that's done to sort of set the stage for a larger environment. And importantly, tell us whether or not it's worth our while in spending more money and time on a larger experiment. So while we can't make sweeping generalizations from this study, we can be a little bit more informed when it comes to making our risk assessments in the realm of flour. We can feel a little better about keeping some wheat flour in the home under the following conditions: that we have good hygienic cleaning practices of surfaces and mixers, that we wait at least an hour before preparing gluten-free food. An hour is just easier to remember and also gives a little more lead time. And we should also try to prepare gluten-free foods at least 5 to 10 feet away from a flour source. And this is in keeping with another study that was done about 5 or 6 years ago in the UK. So this is really exciting research to me because this is the research that makes the most immediate impact for our patients with celiac disease. It's tangible, relatable, and can be put to use immediately. Research looking at medication, disease pathways, et cetera, absolutely have their place and are very important. But we as patients need to know what we're doing while we wait for these alternative therapies. So that brings us into our second section for tonight about patient experience. There's some overlap definitely with some of the topics we already covered last week. So we'll skim over those a little, but there's still some really good stuff to dig into here. Now, the first study digs into why people get into the celiac field in the first place. And unsurprisingly, in my opinion, they found that some form of personal involvement with celiac disease is a large motive for research among celiac researchers. This group looked at other researchers in the fields of celiac disease, irritable bowel disease, and type 1 diabetes. Some form of personal involvement in the disease was highest in celiac disease. In fact, 2 of the 5 providers in our celiac clinic have celiac ourselves, myself and Dr. Coburn. This also holds true for many of our research partners. Either they have celiac themselves or have a family member with it. This next chart, and again, you'll have to excuse some of the poor quality since I scanned it from the abstract book. It shows the data a little bit differently, more so in the degree of personal involvement among celiac disease. It's kind of hard to see, but IBD is the darkest column, then celiac, and then type 1 diabetes. Now, celiac had the highest percentage of multiple levels of personal involvement. Oops, you can see that here in the middle. And so who knows, maybe some of our patients will get inspired by their celiac disease and dedicate their life to researching it. Now, we did cover the advent of telemedicine last week, so I'm going to just briefly gloss over these next 2 studies just for the sake of time. 2 studies in the UK looked at telemedicine in celiac disease care. One was actually more of a literature review where they analyzed 8 studies already published on the topic. Their results indicated that telemedicine is a promising tool in celiac disease follow-up care. The other study differed slightly from some of the other telemedicine studies we've seen. Now, they've found that 25% of patients preferred telemedicine appointments, 51% preferred in-person appointments, and 24% reported a mixture of both or had no preference. So preferences truly are a mixed bag, but in our case, we plan to continue offering both telemedicine and in-person visits to the celiac clinic. But that's outpatient. We have a choice in the matter of whether we go in person or not. But what about inpatient care when someone is admitted to the hospital or has to reside in a long-term care facility? The Canadian Celiac Association decided that they would investigate this exact question. They surveyed 52 long-term care facilities throughout Canada on their practices in handling patients with a gluten-free diet. 66% of the facilities reported that they regularly provided gluten-free meals, while 24% did not provide them at all. One of the facilities said that they could provide them if a patient needed them, and another one didn't even know if they could provide gluten-free meals. Families of celiac patients in long-term facilities also completed the survey. Half of families reported difficulty in finding long-term facilities that could accommodate the gluten-free diet. And even then, many patients reported limited food choices and getting mainly prepackaged meals rather than freshly cooked meals. According to the families, food service staff tended to have limited knowledge of the gluten-free diet, and some residents even reported gluten ingestion from food served to them from these facilities. Now, I think there are 2 very important takeaways from this abstract. First, long-term care facilities, at least in Canada, are woefully unprepared for celiac patients. And secondly, it reminds us what we should do in a situation if us as adults or our children are admitted to a hospital and have to eat hospital-prepared meals. I highly recommend requesting a physician order for a gluten-free diet be placed upon admittance to ensure the need for a gluten-free diet is well documented. Food services at some hospitals sometimes even have access to these orders so that they can nix certain food items ordered if it doesn't comply with the patient's orders. Earlier this year, I broke my arm and had to have surgery to fix it and was in the hospital for about 3 days. And I had them put a gluten-free diet order in so that when I ordered, if I was a little woozy from some of the pain medications and I ordered something that wasn't gluten-free, they would automatically substitute for something else. So marching right along, we come now to 2 abstracts that kind of capture the bane of my existence in celiac disease, which is social media. Our psychologist, Dr. Coburn, was a co-author at a study that looked at Twitter trends revolving around celiac disease and the gluten-free diet. They found, unsurprisingly, that most material on Twitter was provided by self-promoters, commercial entities, or female family members rather than qualified medical professionals. The hashtag gluten-free was used 20 times more than hashtag celiac. Hashtag gluten-free users most commonly identified themselves as bloggers or writers, and hashtag celiac users more commonly identified themselves as bloggers and moms. Additionally, the links that were shared with certain hashtags had some slightly concerning trends. As some background, .org and .gov websites tend to have better, more accurate information on them than .com links. Hashtag celiac used .com links 16.8 times more than .org and 44.7 times more than .gov sites. And similarly, hashtag gluten-free used .com links 54.7 times more than .org and 1,173 times more than .gov. Now, of note, PubMed, which is the NIH's resource for primary sources, uses a .gov web address, meaning that the vast majority of information being shared on Twitter is likely not coming from a primary source. There is definitely then an identifiable risk that misinformation is spreading via Twitter. By the same token, researchers in Italy looked at misinformation on Facebook groups. The study they did was not as deep of a dive as I would like to do, but they still found some interesting information. They found that 12% of these pages allowed unauthentic information to remain visible to group members. 5% of pages posted incorrect information about gluten-free recipes, and 7% of pages claimed to have an alternative treatment for celiac disease. Many Facebook pages also confounded celiac disease and wheat allergies. Now, looking at this, I don't need to tell you that this is not only frustrating, but dangerous. Many of these groups have quote unquote moderators, but these moderators themselves are almost never medical professionals. Some of these groups have tens of thousands of members, so moderators may not be able to actually moderate. Additionally, they're also volunteers. This isn't their job, so they're maybe not as inclined to be really stringent about what gets posted. I see so many patients come into our clinic extremely flustered by what they read on Facebook support groups, which is why I never recommend them outside of our own, which is moderated by me, until patients are more comfortable with the diagnosis and the gluten-free diet. Now, one thing I do see in these groups is frustration with the gluten-free diet. And while I've been eating gluten-free for the last 15 years, I still sometimes get frustrated with it. I take comfort in knowing, though, that there are some aspects of dissatisfaction with the gluten-free diet that have grown over the years. So before we move into these last two studies in this section, you may say, but Kate, you told us last week that it gets better with time and you had the research to back it up. And I say to that, yes, that's true. It does get better with time, and people tend to really accept the gluten-free diet and view it either neutrally or positively. But there's a difference between that and viewing the diet as sufficient. So Beyond Celiac conducted community surveys in 2014 and 2022 to determine patient perception of the gluten-free diet as sufficient treatment for celiac disease. The graph of the results was pretty obvious in representing people's thoughts. You can see that generally the satisfaction has gone down, that's in gray, and the dissatisfaction has gone, or maybe that's in blue, and the dissatisfaction has very much risen. Now, people in the UK have similar views as in the US. Over 2,400 people with celiac disease were surveyed about their thoughts of new therapeutics for celiac disease. 86.1% of respondents said that a new therapeutic to be taken alongside remaining on a gluten-free diet was very or extremely important. And 73.7% of responders said that a new therapeutic to replace the gluten-free diet was either very or extremely important. There was a wide range of what they would find acceptable for how the therapy would be administered, though, whether that be intravenously, so through an IV, via injection like a shot, or via a pill. So this brings us to my next question or three questions rather for tonight. So in the chat, if you want to put down first, would you be interested in an alternative therapeutic for either your celiac disease or your child's celiac disease? Secondly, would the method of delivery change your opinion? So if it was an IV drug versus a pill, would that change your mind? And third, would you be interested in either replacing the gluten-free diet or just adding something to the gluten-free diet, or both? So for example, adding something to the gluten-free diet would look more like taking a pill that might help mitigate some cross contact, but you still can't eat, for example, a gluten-containing sandwich. So I'll give you about a minute or so to have a think, and you can put those responses in the chat at the bottom of your screen. And while you're typing, I know that I personally would be interested in some form of alternative therapy for the gluten-free diet. I think that the method or the delivery would depend on, well, I'd have to think that through. Maybe how often the delivery is. For example, if I have to go to like an infusion center and sit there and wait for it. And I would probably be more interested in just what we would call an adjunct therapy, which is where I would still remain on the gluten-free diet, but I would just be able to, for example, not ask a ton of questions about cross contact at a restaurant, but still eat gluten-free, but, you know, have a little bit of gluten get in that can be mitigated by that medication. So we say 1, yes, we would be interested. 2, again, depends on how often the IV would be required. Totally agree. And 3, both. Yeah, I think we're probably closer to getting something that would be adding to the gluten-free diet. A lot of drugs, and we'll take a look at them, but a lot of them are geared more towards people who are still having symptoms despite being on the gluten-free diet. And part of that may be because of cross contact. So that will bring us then to our last section of the night. Oops. Future treatments. Now, there was a lot of research that was happening in this arena, as you can see, and we would need several hours to go through all of these individually. And even then, it would probably be a really dry webinar with a lot of terminology that goes over everyone's heads, mine included. So we're going to go through some of the more promising therapies that have provided some updates while at ICDS and talk about them in a little more understandable terms. First, though, we did receive some unfortunate news that the first celiac drug to ever reach phase 3 of FDA trials was discontinued over the summer. The company 9 Meters Biopharma is now working with the FDA to see if there could be other uses for their drug liraglutide. But for now, liraglutide isn't something we'll see anytime soon. Their previous trials, while successful, did not reach enough statistical significance in the interim analysis. And so the company did some statistical calculations and realized that the number of participants they would need to enroll in order to reach that statistical significance was too large to be supported by the study. However, we are still very optimistic about other therapies in the pipeline. And when it comes to disease pathways and how celiac disease develops and how someone with celiac disease reacts to a gluten ingestion, we could refer to this pathway as a series of unfortunate events. There are several things that have to happen in a chain reaction that leads to a celiac disease reaction. So let's identify a few of these places and see what therapeutics are being studied to break these chains. I really like this image from a study done back in 2009, published in the journal Gastroenterology. It shows the pathophysiology of celiac disease as well as identifies in these black boxes with red writing some of the chains we could break using these therapeutics. So let's start up here at the top with modified gluten. So you may already know about gluten-free wheat starch, also called Codex wheat starch, which is wheat starch that has been processed to remove the gluten. The word Codex stems from the Codex Alimentarius, which sets international food standards. But what if we could engineer wheat, the world's most widely grown crop, in a way that's safe for people with celiac disease? Some researchers from Israel presented an abstract about their quest to engineer celiac-safe wheat. They use an algorithm to predict known and new T-cell epitopes and microengineer them to essentially block the binding pathways that are associated with genes that allow celiac disease to develop. Those are DQ2 and DQ8. The gluten proteins then essentially become invisible to T cells, which plays a huge role, T cells, in causing damage to the small intestine when gluten is ingested. Additionally, they even tried baking with this celiac safe wheat, and it worked. They stated that the flour retained its dough functionality and baking properties. That's huge news and could potentially bring some amazing new technology to gluten-free baking as we know it. I'm definitely looking forward to hearing if they do any larger tests. Next, we'll look at glutenases, which are essentially enzymes that would break down the gluten protein into strands, smaller strands that would not cause a reaction. Now, historically, digestive enzymes have not done a great job in getting the job done. And as we know, all of them so far have failed FDA trials at some point. And we definitely know that over-the-counter digestive enzymes, such as the one on the screen, don't do anything for celiac disease. So spend your hard-earned money on something else. There are some enzyme-based therapies in various stages of the FDA trial pipeline. So let's look at some of them presented at ICDS. One of these enzymes is called endoprotease 40. This enzyme breaks down gluten into what's called gluten immunogenic peptides, or GIPs, which are essentially just fragments of gluten proteins. E40, as they call it, managed to digest gluten in the stomach to a maximum of 20 parts per million equivalent. So this is really exciting, but the caveat is that this was not done in humans. This was still in vitro, which means that they take place in a super controlled environment like a laboratory instead of the much more chaotic human body. AME01 is another example of an enzyme that's currently being tested in laboratories. So this has a similar method of action of breaking gluten down into GIPs. You can see the kind of Pac-Man there on the screen that shows a little bit how it does, and breaking these down into GIPs that go under the radar of T cells. There is another enzyme called TAC062 that's currently in phase 2 FDA trials. It is currently being tested for people with celiac disease who have been on a gluten-free diet for more than 12 months, but still have moderate to severe symptoms. 350 patients will be enrolled across North America and Europe. One group will receive 3 snack bars per week containing around 500 milligrams each of gluten, and one group will receive 3 snack bars per week that don't contain gluten. They will then assess whether or not the enzyme successfully broke down gluten proteins enough so that there's no intestinal damage. So a round of applause for these study members who are not only taking an experimental, though well-studied drug, but are also signing themselves up to potentially eat gluten. Now, the last enzyme that had some data at ICDS was called lattaglutenase. This is one of the more well-known enzymes in the celiac world. Researchers are currently recruiting for phase 2B trials. The data they presented at ICDS showed that there was a 90% reduction of gluten in the urine of patients eating small amounts of gluten when compared to the placebo. That's pretty impressive. They were also able to identify the mechanism of action, which is very important to know in drug trials. And moving on down our chain reactions into chains we could break, we can talk about permeability inhibitors, therapies that would block gluten's entry through the epithelial barrier. So this is the epithelial barrier. This is the epithelium here that break through, blocking that breaking through, causing that autoimmune reaction. Lorazepam, the drug that was discontinued at phase 3, just this past summer actually, would fall under this category, but fear not, we still have 2 other permeability inhibitors that are in trials right now. So the first is IMU-856. So this compound is believed to help regulate intestinal barrier function and regenerate small bowel epithelium. The phase 1 studies that were presented looked at healthy volunteers, again, just meaning people without celiac disease, to test for safety, tolerability, and the pharmacokinetics of the drug. The phase 1B trial is currently ongoing, so far with only mild adverse events and no concerns for safety or tolerability. The pharmaceutical company called Immunic Therapeutics, who are running these trials, believe that this drug will not cause immunosuppression, which is a very attractive fact if true. Another ongoing trial is a drug called AGY, which is made from the yolks of immunized hens. It's believed that AGY sort of neutralizes gluten, which then prevents it from being absorbed, and by association prevents a reaction from taking place. This is currently in a phase 2 study. Now, the poster itself at the conference was about how they've been navigating through recruiting during the COVID-19 pandemic, which unsurprisingly has proved to be challenging. However, they have started remote participation, which is a really great precedent to help set, and it doesn't affect safety. Now, next on our handy dandy roadmap of unfortunate events, we have lymphocyte blocking therapies. This means that the drug blocks lymphocytes, a type of cell in our immune system, from sending out the alarm. We'll briefly go over one of these therapies that was presented. So this therapy uses thymulin, which is a hormone which acts as an IL-15 inhibitor. IL-15 simply means interleukin-15. Interleukins are a type of cytokine, which are proteins that are important in cell signaling. IL-15 is believed to play an important role in communicating the quote-unquote threat of gluten to the body in celiac disease. Essentially, IL-15 tattletales to killer T cells that gluten has entered the body, and then the T cells begin destroying what they believe to be infected tissue. Thymulin, a hormone, was found to have significantly reduced levels of inflammatory markers in the body, as well as reduced levels of damage in the small intestine in animal models. So this is just part of that early stage of drug development. So with these promising results, it could make its way towards human trials in the coming years. One of the downsides, though, of these lymphocyte blocking therapies is that there will likely always be some sort of immunosuppression side effect. So the pros and cons of taking one of these drugs would have to be carefully considered. I've been doing this for 15 years, so at this point, I would rather just stick to the gluten-free diet, but for some, than be immunosuppressed. But for some people, they would rather take the risk of a higher risk of infection in order to be able to eat gluten, or at this point, at least small amounts of it. Next up are TTG inhibitors. Now, TTG, as I hope we all know by now, is tissue transglutaminase, an enzyme that fixes damage in the body. In celiac disease, we develop antibodies that attack this enzyme. When someone with celiac disease eats gluten, a chemical reaction called deamidation occurs that then alerts the T cells to the gut to an invader, then causing an immune reaction. These therapies then would be designed around inhibiting or blocking TTG's ability to create this chemical reaction. The first abstract is currently in animal testing. Researchers in India tested a chemical compound called cysteamine and its effectiveness in inhibiting TTG. They found that it seemed to work and actually showed a significant difference in mucosal healing patterns. These results of the study are really promising and are an important step of bringing this into human trials. The other TTG inhibitor currently that had abstracts at ICDS was called Z1227. Now, by my count, there were at least 4 other abstracts on this therapy alone. So for the sake of time and sanity, we are not going to be reviewing all of those abstracts, but let's go over the key points. Z1227 is currently in phase 2 trials and has shown some encouraging results. Again, it blocks TTG, which then blocks a celiac reaction and the damage that comes with it. When taking this drug and eating gluten, patients had less intestinal damage than the placebo group. The abstracts presented at ICDS on the drug ranged from phase 2 data, animal models, and tests for mechanisms of action. It sounds like as of earlier this year, they are recruiting for phase 2B trials. Now, next up is a therapy that looks to act on the genetic portion of this series of unfortunate events. A group of researchers from Singapore, Australia, Japan, and Norway who looked at antibodies in rabbits that may help block the DQ2 genes effect in our chain of events. Now, we commonly associate DQ2 and DQ8 as the 2 most common genes identified in celiac disease, with DQ2 being much more commonly seen than DQ8. Animal models in this study showed that these antibodies were effective in blocking gluten-related responses and were also selective, meaning that the antibodies didn't start blocking a bunch of other genes in addition to DQ2. The researchers concluded that this therapy is expected to have good pharmacokinetics, that is movement and excretion of the drug through the body, low toxicity risk, and a strong and extensive inhibitory effect against gluten-dependent immune responses in celiac disease. It's important to note, though, that this is not changing the gene, rather it's just preventing it from doing its part in this job of creating an autoimmune reaction. Now, the last section of this roadmap is tolerance induction, essentially teaching our body to tolerate gluten when we eat it. One of the more well-known drugs in this category was Nexvax2, which was discontinued in 2019 after phase 2 trials showed no significant difference between the drug and placebo. While it was sad to see what was initially a really promising drug go down the drain, we still have the benefit of having lots of shots on goal, so to speak. One of the abstracts at ICDS was an in vitro study, so done in a lab, looking at targeting dendritic cells. Dendritic cells initiate and regulate certain immune responses and communicate with T cells. Some previous research done indicated that dendritic cells can actually help promote T cell tolerance. So that is kind of teaching our T cells that we don't need to go and kill tissue when we have gluten coming through our epithelium. Researchers in Italy engineered dendritic cells using a virus called lentivirus to help sort of train T cells not to react to the presence of gluten. And they succeeded. That's great news, but we also have to remember, again, this was done in a laboratory, and what works in a lab doesn't always work in the human body. But again, this is a great step in narrowing down what could be used in clinical trials in the future. Another study is for a drug called TAC-101, manufactured by the pharmaceutical company Takeda. In this drug, researchers take gluten and package it in nanoparticles, which simply means a very, very small particle. One of our research partners, Dr. Jocelyn Sylvester at Boston Children's Hospital, says you can think of it like a ping pong ball. On the inside of the ball are gluten proteins, and that outside shell is made of a sugar that's actually used to coat joint replacements. So we know that the coating is safe. It's delivered via an IV into the bloodstream, and those nanoparticles then go to the spleen where they help sort of reprogram those T cells that cause damage in celiac. So far, the results have been promising as they are currently in phase 2B. Blood work of the participants has shown less T cell activation as well as less villus damage. There is the potential that this could actually replace the diet, but there will need to be many more studies in order to ensure a completely gluten-full diet won't hurt someone with celiac. The last study that looks at taming the body's immune response was CAN-101, for which I wrote in a newsletter back in June. Now, Inokion, the pharmaceutical company in Boston that's pioneering this drug, presented a lot of information both at Digestive Disease Week in May, as well as in Sorrento for ICDS. The drug works via the liver, which is a novel concept when it comes to treating celiac disease. So the liver is like a giant filter in our body. It helps get rid of not only toxins, but it also helps to clear waste generated by our body, like dead cells. As one of the filters in our bodies, it's uniquely positioned to contain sort of frontline immune cells that alert the rest of the immune system to pathogens entering the gut and mount a response. So CAN-101 uses this immune pathway to induce tolerance to gliadin, the part of the gluten protein that causes an immune reaction in people with celiac disease. So far, there were excellent results, no deaths, no serious adverse events. Liver function tests remained normal throughout the study. And this is really important because elevated liver function tests are a common side effect with drugs that involve our immune system. And before we get carried away, this is only just finishing phase 1. It's a huge hurdle to jump because about 90% of drugs fail phase 1 testing. However, about 31% of drugs fail phase 2, and that number jumps to about 58% failing phase 3. We could find out what CAN-101's fate will be pretty soon, though. The FDA granted it fast track designation status, which means that there will be a lot less downtime during CAN-101's testing process. The drug, if it makes it to market, will still be just as safe as other drugs that make it to the market at a slower pace, but it'll just involve less bureaucracy. Lastly, there are drugs, and this is kind of that FDA process there. Lastly, there are researchers that are looking for drugs that have already been FDA approved that may benefit patients with celiac. Some of these drugs are already used in Crohn's or ulcerative colitis. Researchers in India decided to go down this route and test for what's called a cathepsin S inhibitor. Cathepsin S is a type of enzyme that's important for general protein turnover, antigen processing, and even bone remodeling. Cathepsin S inhibitors are used in medications mainly for cancer, but they're also starting to be studied in autoimmune diseases. Now, I think their mode of method of research was really interesting. First, they screened a database of FDA-approved drugs that uses, or rather that they approved they looked through FDA-approved drugs that use a technique that predicts how proteins interact with small molecules called ligands. So using this and other parameters, they then held an in silico study, which means that they used a computer program to predict what would happen. They found that retapamulin used to treat impetigo, benzhydrocodone, which is an opioid, fulcodine, which is a cough suppressant, aprepitant, which is an antiemetic, anti-nausea medication, oseltamivir, which is better known as Tamiflu, and valproate sodium, which is used to treat epilepsy, all had high docking scores, as they call them. They will, of course, need many more studies to work with these results to make sure that the right things are targeted, but cathepsin S inhibition has already been deemed an important drug target for celiac disease, making these findings really interesting. So overall, there are dozens of drugs currently in FDA trials looking at helping patients with celiac disease, and dozens more in preclinical and laboratory studies. Many researchers are hoping that if all goes well, we may have something on the market in the next decade. While it feels like a long wait, it's important because it means that they're thoroughly testing these drugs before we take them. I think it will be worth the wait for a lot of people. And so on that note, we are going to bring tonight's webinar to a close. Please feel free, if you have any last questions, to put them in that Q&A box or in the chat below. And if you still have any after we leave, you can email those to me at celiac@childrensnational.org. We are recording both of these webinars and we'll be posting them on our website at a later date so that you can revisit them. And so thank you all again for attending tonight. I'm just going to quickly look in the chat here. All right, thank you guys so much for coming and have a wonderful night.